أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين، واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: ومن تاب وعمل صالحا فإنه يتوب إلى الله متابا، والذين لا يشهدون الزور وإذا مروا باللغو مروا كراما. آمنا بالله، صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد. Your second salawat for love of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. And your loudest salawat to hasten the master of our time, Sahib al-Asr. Salli ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بذكرنا المسائب أبا عبد الله. May Allah increase in our reward for commemorating the difficulties of Imam al-Hussain. We're discussing the attributes of Ibadur Rahman, that those that Allah refers to as his servants, what qualities do they possess? In the interest that in these nights, as we remember Imam Hussain, we develop those qualities within ourselves that Allah describes are of his true servants, such that we may be counted amongst those who are the helpers of Imam Hussain. When we say, for example, the phrase, Ya laytani kunna ma'akum fanafuza ma'akum, woe that we could have been with you, we would have attained a great success with you in the field of Karbala. The attributes of the person who would be with Imam Hussain are important to develop in our character. The attributes of a person who would know the difference between helping Imam Hussain and being his enemy. Remember that on the day of Ashura, the enemy of Imam Hussain was also calling, finish this war, it's time to pray. Amongst the enemies of Imam Hussain were also those who recited Quran. So the attributes are not something that, for example, come naturally. They have to be developed, and if one does not develop them, they can be on the wrong side of haqq. In the verse that we're beginning our discussion with, it continues from yesterday's conversation. وَمَنْ تَابَ وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا فَإِنَّهُ يَتُوبُ إِلَى اللَّهِ مَتَابًا. That one who seeks forgiveness and performs good deeds, certainly he returns to Allah a righteous turning, or a goodly turning, that he comes back to Allah in the proper way. There's some explanation that says that sometimes there are actions that are more beloved to Allah, that this turning back to Allah is more beloved to him than, for example, simply one who worships Allah. Because one who turns back to Allah is also someone who is fearful of Allah and is conscious of Allah and comes to Allah in a way that is very humble. The example of this comes from the time of Nabi Musa alayhi salam. That in the time of Nabi Musa, there used to be a hermit. A hermit is someone who isolates himself from society, secludes himself, and busies himself only with one task. And this hermit in the time of Nabi Musa was someone who had stayed alone in a cave for 100 years. 100 years. He stayed alone and he worshipped. And then, as it would happen, that someone passing by told him that there's a prophet of Allah who is on the way here. And this hermit became curious that he wanted to meet Nabi Musa. He wanted to meet this prophet of Allah. So he left his hermitage, and nearby they said Nabi Musa was going to be passing by. So he went nearby, and when he went with some confidence. Call it confidence. And when Nabi Musa came by, he said to Nabi Musa, he said, come here. You're the Prophet of Allah? He says, yes. I have something I want you to ask Allah for me. Nabi Musa says, what do you want? The hermit says, I have stayed in my cave and I have done no other activity than to worship Allah for 100 years. 100 years. I want you to ask Allah, what is my reward with him for this action? Nabi Musa says, okay. So he prays. And Jibreel comes and says, Musa, tell him we'll give him an answer tomorrow. So Nabi Musa says, oh hermit, Allah has said he will answer you, but tomorrow. Hermit says, I waited 100 years. One more day. Okay, no problem. So the hermit says, okay, I'll see you here tomorrow. Now the routine of the hermit was that because he was a hermit, he didn't keep a lot of supplies with him. Every day he would leave his place, go to the river, collect water that he would need for the day. And whatever, he would forage around the forest for to eat. And that was his food and water for the day. And the rest of the time he would spend in worship of Allah. And sure enough, the next morning came and the hermit left his house early morning. And he went to go collect his water. And he went to go collect his food. But after 100 years of doing this morning he got lost. And he couldn't find his way. And he couldn't figure out where he was. He couldn't reach the water. He couldn't find his food. Lost and wandering, he started realizing that as a hermit, I have no nutrition, I have no strength, and I only eat and drink enough to survive. Now, if I don't eat and drink at an appropriate time, I'm going to die. So he finds I'm lost in the woods and I'm about to die. And he's like, if I don't find this, and he starts panicking and worrying. Eventually, as he's panicking and worrying, he hears the sound of someone coming. So he goes towards the sound and he finds a man who is traveling through the wilderness. And he says to him, help me, I'm about to die. He says, give me some of your water so that I can live. The man says, Baba, I'm in the wilderness just like you. I only have enough water for me. If I give you my water, there's no guarantee I'll live. The hermit says, but you're healthy. You can last longer than I can. You'll get to water. I know it's here somewhere. I'm just lost. He says, I don't know. What can you give me in exchange for me taking the risk of my life on for saving you? The hermit says, I haven't done anything. I don't possess anything. I'm a hermit. All I have done is I have worshipped Allah for 100 years. So the man says, okay, fine. Give me your 100 years of worship. The hermit's about to die. So he says, fine. May Allah give me another 100 years. I'll keep worshipping Allah for the rest of my life. I'll give you my 100 years of ibadat so that you save my life now. The man says, okay, fine. I'll take the risk. He says, I'll get 100 years worth of ibadat as a reward and you get 1 cup of water. Okay. He gives him the water. The hermit survives. He eventually gains his strength, figures out where he is, finds the water that he needs, his rations, goes back to his cave, and then comes the time to meet Nabi Musa. So he goes to the place where he's supposed to meet Nabi Musa, and at that time, Jibreel comes to Nabi Musa and says, say to this hermit that if the price of 1 cup of water is 100 years of worship, what about the cup of water that Allah has given you every day for the last 100 years? How will you compensate Allah? Allahu Akbar. Ya Rasulullah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ali. See, the man wanted to know what reward he had earned because he thought for the good deeds that I'm doing, Allah should reward me. But really, all 100 years of good deeds that he did barely compensated for 1 cup of water that Allah gave him in that 100 years. He had never compensated Allah for all the good things that Allah gave him. So how dare he come and demand that Allah reward me? He wanted a reward when he hasn't even done justice to the barakat and the ni'mat that Allah gave him. Which is why when he heard Nabi Musa say this, that, oh hermit, if the cost of 1 cup of water is 100 years of worship, then how do you intend to compensate Allah for all of the cups of water that he gave you before you're demanding a reward from him? Hearing this, the hermit that pride that he had himself, that confidence that he had, that he was someone who would be special in the eyes of Allah and worthy of worship, all washed away instantly. And he realized how ungrateful of a servant of Allah he was. How ungrateful. That he's demanding a reward, yet he's never once thanked Allah or been aware of all of the bounties that Allah has given him. In that instance, when he comes to this realization, he says, I seek refuge with Allah, astaghfirullah, and falls into prostration before Allah. At this moment, Jibreel comes and says, O Musa, say to him that this one istighfar has greater reward with Allah than those 100 years of worship with pride that he gave Allah. Ya Ali. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. That's why Allah says, وَمَنْ تَابَ وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا فَإِنَّهُ يَتُوبُ إِلَى اللَّهِ مَتَابًا. One who turns back to Allah and performs good deeds, certainly he has turned to Allah with khair and goodness, that he has turned back to Allah repentantly in a good way. That repentance that we have for Allah and that istighfar that we do to Allah, that seeking of his forgiveness, is one of the ways that we show our humility that, oh Allah, how can we be worthy of anything in your eyes when you have given us so much? Istighfar is such a thing that our Holy Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, rahmatul lil alameen, mercy to all of humanity, the perfection of humanity, did istighfar every day of his life at least 70 times. That him, the Prophet of Allah, the perfect example of him, by whom there is the mercy of Allah on this earth, that his punishment has been removed from this earth, even that holy being worshipped Allah through istighfar as well too. Which is why it's a very important attribute that we have in our characteristics, that we develop this. When we are the servants of Allah, we don't shy away from doing istighfar. We stay close to him. You guys are okay? Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The next verse of this conversation says, وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَشْهَدُونَ الزُّورَ وَإِذَا مَرُّوا بِاللَّغْوِ مَرُّوا كِرَامًا. These are the next two attributes, the 10th and 11th attributes that we want to develop. There's something of a conversation behind them because there's one apparent meaning and then there's a secondary meaning that both are applicable to this. The first meaning, when we take a look at the 10th attribute, وَإِذَا وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَشْهَدُونَ زُورًا. وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَشْهَدُونَ زُورًا literally translates to those who don't bear false witness. Zura, the kalima zura, one of its meanings is to lie. And shahadat of lying is to bear a false witness. So some of the English translations or translations that you look in other languages, they simply introduce the statement as those who don't lie when they bear witness. That when they bear witness, when they give shahadat, when they speak the truth. The other interpretation of this is a little bit deeper. That zura also refers to using foul language, filthy language, and to, for example, singing, and, for example, speaking in bad ways about people. And the concept of وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَشْهَدُونَ الزُّورَ, to be a shahid of something, is to also to participate in something. So the second explanation that comes of this attribute is that those who don't participate in profane or foul language or foul conversations, they are not present in this. Hatta to the extent that our sixth Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, explains this in a way that some people didn't understand for some time. He explains, he says, Zura is profane singing. Is that singing which includes profanity, foul language, bad words. This definition ties closely to the next attribute that we'll talk about as well too. وَإِذَا مَرُّوا بِاللَّغْوِ مَرُّوا كِرَامًا. There's some explanation here that ties these two together. But some people, for example, profane singing. The question was, where is profane singing? Remember, this is 1400 years ago. that they were singing, and singing wasn't necessarily always associated with profanity. But in our contemporary time, there is no singing without profanity anymore. That profanity has become the fundamental of all of this lahu and la'ab and laghu. That these attributes that Allah dislikes, these actions that are, for example, wasteful and abusive, they've become very closely tied to foul language and abusive language. So one of the deeper explanations of this, وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَشْهَدُونَ الزُّورَ, is not simply that you don't use or give false testimony against someone, but rather that if there is something that includes profanity, or there is singing that includes profanity, or there is an environment that includes profanity, using foul language, bad words, that you are not someone who participates in this environment. That if you want to be a mu'min, that it's something you don't participate in. Now the second half of this verse of the Quran, where it says, وَإِذَا مَرُّوا بِاللَّغْوِ مَرُّوا كِرَامًا, that if they pass by something that is lagh, that is a vain conversation, is an abusive or a wasteful action, marru kirama, they pass by it nobly. This attribute refers to, in its apparent nature, refers to that if there is, for example, an environment that is a wasteful environment or abusive environment or a place that Allah does not like to be, a mu'min in ibadur rahman, a servant of Allah, is someone who, when he comes to that environment, passes by it nobly, does not participate in this process. That they stay away from being away from these ignoble places and places where harm can come to them. We see our A'immah, they explain, they said places of profanity, places of evil and sin are places where mu'mineen should be known to avoid these places. Because one who participates in this place or is present in this place should not then be surprised when he is considered to be of these people and of these characteristics. See, I may go to a place and say that I won't do anything wrong there. I won't be someone who does the haram actions there. The Imam is explaining, as soon as you're present in that place, you are from amongst those people and you'll be considered amongst those people. No one will listen to you at that point in time to believe you that, no, you really didn't do anything wrong or bad. They'd say, Baba, we saw you there. That's enough. These proms, school dances, bars, clubs, all of these places, sometimes our youth, their friends call them and say, let's go. Let's go. And that child in his mind is confident that if I go there, I won't participate. But he says, they're insisting, let me go with them. Especially this year with the proms and whatnot, that children from our own communities said, all of my friends are going. It is a rite of passage in this country that you attend one of these events and that you should be present with your classmates. Peer pressure. But the reality is that Allah is telling us that to be a mu'min, you don't even enter these locations. That being present in these locations makes you as blameful as the others, as well as it opens the door to more sin for your activities. In understanding how this tanbih, this warning is understood, there's an example that some ulama have used. They said that everything that exists comes into existence in three phases. And I give the example, for example, a human being. Before a human being is born, it goes through a period of gestation. In this period of gestation, its characteristics, its attributes are developed. It's given some resources and energy to prepare it then to come into life, which is the second phase, that it is alive and present before you. And when the second phase completes, it goes into a third phase in which it leaves or it finishes its life, but its effects remain on afterwards. The same is true, we know, of, for example, a disease. A disease or a sickness that happens in our body, right, begins with its own gestation period where it begins to grow. It begins to grow and develop. Then eventually we see the symptoms of the disease, and that's when we know that this disease has reached its full growth. We are seeing the symptoms, the characteristics, the problems associated with it. And then eventually, after the symptoms leave us, the disease, its effects remains in our body for some time. Sometimes forever. It can come back at any point in time. And sometimes for a period of time, we remain susceptible to the sickness in our body. The same is true with all of Allah's creations. They go through these three phases. One is of gestation, preparation before it comes into the world. The second is that period where its effects are present in front of us. And the third are its effects after it has left us. The same that's true for the physical world is true for the spiritual world. That sin comes in these three formats as well too. There's the parts of the sin before we actually perform the sin, we think about it. We are mentally aware of it. The idea of the sin and our interest in it is growing. Then the action is performed. We perform the sin, na'udhu billah. We perform the ma'siyah. And then eventually, after we've completed that action, the effects of that sin remain with us. Whether the effects of that sin are spiritually or physically or emotionally, the effect of that sin remains. When Allah is giving us these instructions, وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَشْهَدُونَ الزُّورَ وَإِذَا مَرُّوا بِاللَّغْوِ مَرُّوا كِرَامًا. Allah is telling us that the mu'min is the one who does not need to fall into the actual act of the sin and witness the reality of the sin to know to stay away from it. The mu'min is the one for whom the awareness that the sin can take place is sufficient for him to go and protect himself from that activity. It's true. I may go to an event that, for example, has profanity, has foul language, and I may be able to protect myself. But the attribute of the mu'min is not that at that moment he doesn't perform the action. No, the step before that activity, when it is establishing in me and I'm becoming comfortable with the idea, is when the mu'min protects himself from that action. Allah's instruction through these two attributes, that don't use and don't witness, don't attend those places that are associated with profanity, and don't be someone who, when they see an unfortunate or inappropriate place, attends that place. Allah is telling you that if you want to have iman, the way to protect your iman is avoid all of those things that can cause you harm and damage your future self. That's our goal. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Ya Ali. We mentioned the second meaning that, for example, وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَشْهَدُونَ الزُّورَ is that those who don't listen to profanity or listen to profanity and singing and profane singing. The second half of this verse that talks about, we're getting a little technical. You guys are okay? It's important to understand this. This is why this is going to be very practical. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain this. وَإِذَا مَرُّوا بِاللَّغْوِ مَرُّوا كِرَامًا. That if they come upon a place of laghu. Laghu refers to all those activities that are wasteful, that are useless. An example of this comes in the time of our Prophet. Our Prophet entered the mosque and the community was gathered around the man and listening to him intently. So Rasulullah asked, who is this and what's going on? And he said, this is an alim. This is a scholar. He is knowledgeable and scholarly in the history of the lineages of people from the time of Jahiliyyah. And he knows all of the information of those lineages and those nobilities that existed in the period of Jahiliyyah. And he's educating the people about those people and those events and those attributes of Jahiliyyah and who were the nobility of that time. And he's very knowledgeable. Our Prophet replied, said, هذا علم لا ينفع علمه ولا يضر جهله. He says, this knowledge that this man is sharing is such a knowledge that having this knowledge won't benefit you any. And being ignorant of this knowledge won't harm you anything. This is the example of something that is laghu. Something that is wasteful. Knowing it gives you nothing better. Not knowing it causes you no harm. In our day and age, where we are in this information age, where every piece of data can be collected and stored and information can be used, in this age, there is much that fits the category of laghu. For example, and the kids may know this better than the adults, knowing all the statistics of your favorite basketball players. knowing the history and the points per game and all of this information. Baba, not only are you likely not to meet that individual, even if you met him, the conversation is going to be about, it's not going to be about, how many points did you score every game? The same is true, for example, of many different things that we have access and information to today. One of the responsibilities we have is that we filter information to determine, is this beneficial? Is this something that's going to be supportive to me? Is this something that's helpful to me? Or is this a waste of my time? For example, for the younger children, knowing the movie characters and all of their names and who are the characters that play the movie personality and what their ages are and what they do and what they like to eat and what they don't like to eat. Some of our children know all of this because it's the culture that we exist in. Because the information is out there and I can find it on the internet, I should know about it. Knowing where they go, what they like to eat, where they like to shop, what they like to wear. All of this is things that if we're not guiding our children, they're falling into this path where they see that this is an appropriate thing and that we should do this. But Allah is describing that if you want to be my servant, إِذَا مَرُّوا بِاللَّغْوِ, that if you pass by these things or if you're exposed to these things, مَرُّوا كِرَامًا, that you pass by them nobly, that you don't get involved in these affairs. There's an important way, before we get into, there's another meaning here. There's an important way that you can protect your children from this. That this attribute of getting lost in these material things and lost in this world, there are things that you can do to correct this. One of the ways that you can correct this problem, I think we have some time, I think I can do this, is why is that child interested in these items? A child naturally wants to look up to someone. A child has an interest of following and mirroring the examples that are presented before him. Some of those things a father can give for the child, meaning that for some things, a child will follow the father and follow the father's example exactly. But as that child gets older, the environment plays an influence. The environment of this country is to separate the children from the parents. And that's done intentionally. For a child to believe that my father knows nothing, that I shouldn't listen to my father, I shouldn't listen to my mother, is one of the attributes of the culture of this country. Some of the parents, especially who have grown up overseas, know this. They said, I never questioned my father, but my child questions me all the time. There's a reason for that. The reason for that is that they want the child to be independent in buying and selling. They want the child to have disposable income. It's a materialistic environment. You see, an adult has responsibilities. When I see something foolish, I think many times that I have to pay my mortgage, I have to pay, for medical bills, I have to pay for food, groceries before I make a purchase. A child has no liability. He only has income. So the environment designs it in such a way that the child doesn't listen. They don't want the child to listen to the parents anymore. They want the child to individually make decisions about what he buys and sells. So they create a relationship where the child comes to an age where he believes my father knows nothing. Na'uzubillah. My mother knows nothing. I don't need to listen to them. This is the culture of the media that we're in. And this is what's going on. One of the ways that you change this is that as that child gets older and is looking for someone to look up to and is being separated from the father, is being separated from the mother, is you prepare and introduce individuals for them to look up to other than the TV and media. Our children, when they learn about this TV and media, they're looking up to, they're revering these characters that they see on TV and these sports stars and these singers and all these other people. If you can fill that gap by individuals who you trust, who are good people, to be role models for your child, you can protect them from many of these bad things. But that implies that we have a responsibility. And that responsibility is to give back to our community even when it doesn't benefit me. You see, and not in a bad way. And I'm not talking about this community because I don't know well enough in this community. But most of the time what happens is when you finish with the Hussainiyah and you go to college, you get a job, until you have children, you disappear. It's okay. I know my Islam. It's okay. I don't need anything right now. When you have children, you come back to the Hussainiyah. Why? Because now I need to educate my children. I need the Hussainiyah to support my children. But that time when you were away from the Hussainiyah, you never prepared the resources your child needs from the Hussainiyah. You have to invest in the center before you need the center, so that when you need the center, you have the resources there. When I need my child to look up to someone, who did I prepare? Who did I train? Who do I know is appropriate for my child to look up to? Did I invest in anyone? Did I prepare that generation above my child? This is why it's always thinking about prepare the next generation. They will prepare your next generation. It takes investment to protect our children from these problems. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. If we want to protect our children from these attributes, we have to invest in not just our children, but the resources our children need. وَإِذَا مَرُّوا بِاللَّغْوِ مَرُّوا كِرَامًا. And when they see something indecent, inappropriate, they pass by it nobly. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam adds one more layer to this. He says this description of those who, when they pass by laghu, when they pass by something inappropriate, they pass by it with nobility, refers to the language that a person uses. He explains, he says, وَإِذَا مَرُّوا بِاللَّغْوِ refers to an instance where a person has the ability to use foul language, to say something inappropriate, and does not say that's something inappropriate, instead uses appropriate language to pass it by. This explanation is also very important to discuss and understand. The use of foul language is not from the attributes of the mu'mineen, even where it's appropriate. When the Imam says, وَإِذَا مَرُّوا بِاللَّغْوِ, means that they are in a position where they could say something foul and it would be appropriate. The explanation would fit. They're not simply saying something foul for the sake of saying it. But they have decency and haya that even when the word that they could use is foul or inappropriate or graphic, they choose to avoid it and they choose to protect themselves from that language. Our obligations that Allah is teaching us. Allah is teaching us, you want to be my servant? You want to be my servant? Protect yourself. Avoid situations, avoid profanity, avoid indecency. Stay away from those things that are wasteful and harmful to you. Once you get caught in this trap of shaitan, it becomes harder for you to come back to Allah and see the path to Allah. Allah is describing, protect yourselves from those things that will leave a negative effect in your life. And in an Islamic environment, it was very easy not to think about these things because many of these things weren't available. Before technology, many of these things weren't available even here. But now, indecency has spread out very easily and conveniently. And anonymously. We think that no one knows and sees what we do on our phones or in our computers or in our tablets in privacy. But Allah knows. And the effect of those activities remain with us. Which is why part of this is training to stay away from even that which is a precursor to a sin. Staying away from all of those environments and places that will cause harm to us and bring us away from Allah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Inshallah, in our next conversation on Friday, we'll get to the next attribute, the 11th and 12th attributes, as they would be, of Ibadur Rahman. I've mentioned before too that our conversation on this topic has been very brief. There's so much to be said about these issues of understanding how do we implement in our life. But one of the important things as we listen to these things is that these are nights in which our hearts are open to change. And we have the desire to change. And if we make the good intention that we want to come closer to Allah in these nights, He'll make it possible for us. We have the ability to change. This is a night. It is a night that Abu Abdullah asked for. And which is why tonight is a night of ibadat. It's a night of remembering Allah. It's a night where they said we constantly heard a humming coming from the camp of Abu Abdullah. Because all of his companions and people in their rooms were busy worshiping to Allah. And inshallah, after Salah, we'll recite some of the Masa'ib of Shabi Ashur. But tonight, right now, we want to mention that Shaheed who almost changed the field of battle of Imam al-Hussain. See, on this night, when every mother was preparing her child, there was one mother who sat by a crib and she wept. And Sayyidah Zainab came to her and said, "Oh Rabab, why do you cry?" She says, "I think to myself that Layla will stand before your mother Zahra and be proud of the sacrifice she presented to your mother. Ramla will be proud of her sacrifice that she presented before your mother Zahra. al-Baneen will be pleased that she had 4 sons that she presented as sacrifices to protect the son of Zahra. Oh Zainab, I am worried. What sacrifice can I present before your mother Zahra? What will I say to her that my son was only 6 months, that he was not able to make a sacrifice to protect the son of Zahra?" Sayyidah Zainab says, "Rabab, you don't know the sacrifice that you will present for my brother." When the day of Ashur came and all the sacrifices had been presented, and Abu Abdullah called out, "Ala hal min nasirin yansurna?" Is there anyone who will help us? They said a cry came from the tents. When Abu Abdullah returned to the tents and said, "Why have you cried out? Hussein is alive." They said that when you made the call for an assistant, this 6-month-old child turned in his cradle as if he was trying to move. You have to understand something. There was no water in the tent for 3 days. It is difficult for an adult in the heat of the sun to survive for 3 days. Have you ever wondered what happens to a 6-month-old child when they are hungry for 3 days? When a 6-month-old child doesn't eat for 3 days, they don't move anymore. It's almost certain that they have reached the door of death, which is why one of my teachers used to say it would be no surprise that if when Abu Abdullah entered the tents, he said, "Has Asghar died of thirst already?" They said, "Oh, Abu Abdullah, take this child. Maybe they will give him some water." Abu Abdullah loved children. They said when he left the tent because of the heat of the sun, he took Asghar and covered him with a cloak. And then he proceeded out under the sun of Karbala to see the enemy. The enemy in this instance thought that under the cloak of Imam al-Hussein must be the Quran. And now that Abu Abdullah is alone, he has decided to try and debate with us. And they said, "We will never debate with Hussein ibn Ali." And then Imam al-Hussein opened his cloak and presented a child and said, "If I have committed a sin, if there is a problem you have with us as adults, these children have committed no harm. This is a 6-month-old child." Some even go so far as to say that Imam Hussein called, "This child will die anyway now, after being thirsty for 3 days. There is no way this child can survive. Why don't you have mercy on him and give him some water so that he doesn't die of thirst, so that he dies peacefully?" When they refused to reply, Abu Abdullah said, "Okay, if you are afraid that I will drink the water, I will take this child and place him on the ground. You can pick him up and give him water yourself and then give him back to me." Did you ever wonder how long that Imam al-Hussein, who protected Asghar from the heat of the sun, what patience he had that he placed this child on the burning sands of Karbala and waited? And he waited to see that will they have mercy on this infant or not. And this is where we say this was the fight of Asghar. That this started a niza, a debate, an argument in the army of Umar Sa'ad, where some of the soldiers said, "This poor child, what has he done? Give him water." Others said, "Wallah, we swear we will kill the children of Hussein, but we will not give them water." They began to debate, are you truly that heartless? And the army began to have a civil war amongst itself. When Umar Sa'ad saw his soldiers turning against one another, some who wanted to help the infant, some who said kill the infant, some who said don't offer any assistance, some who begged and pleaded for assistance, he says, where is Harmala? Ya Harmala, Aqta Nizam al-Qawm. Stop the debate of this army. Harmala said, oh Umar Sa'ad, what do you want me to do? He said, shoot the child so that the debate finishes. Abu Abdullah lifted the child off the sands of Karbala, held him to his chest. Harmala said, where do I shoot something so small? In this moment, they said that the cloth from Harmala opened. His neck became exposed. The Asghar's neck was seen. Harmala says, I saw as if it was a flash of silver. I took my aim at his neck. I shot an arrow that cut him min al-warid al-warid. I severed the child's neck from one side of his throat to the other. They said, oh Harmala, this is the second arrow you shot in the field of Karbala. Did at any point in time, did your heart not quiver in shame for what you have done? Harmala said, one moment I felt shame. One moment my heart was affected. They said, what was that moment? He says, when I shot the arrow at Asghar, I split him from ear to ear. His arms shot out from the cloth. He began to flap in the arms of his father. The convulsions were as if it was a bird flapping in the arms of his father. I saw Abu Abdullah in this condition as the child convulsed. Abu Abdullah pressed the child to his chest, offered him comfort. Oh Asghar, wait but a moment. My father and mother are waiting for you. Oh Asghar, be patient in this moment. Asghar convulsed in the arms of his father. Some Mu'arrikhin described as a fish flaps out of water. Others said as a bird who has been hunted or killed before it dies, it flaps its wing. Hi Asghar, you had no energy to move from your thirst. Abu Abdullah took his child, turned to the tents. He wanted to honor Rabab the way he honored every mother who presented a sacrifice. He began to proceed towards the tents with this child. And then something overcame him that said, if the children know I have taken Asghar to bring him water. If they were to see that even someone as Asghar, as little as Asghar, they have no mercy over, I fear that the children would die looking at his condition. Abu Abdullah proceeded forward 7 times. He returned back 7 times. How does Abu Abdullah present this child to his mother? Eventually Abu Abdullah stands in front of the tent and calls out, Rabab, come. Rabab comes from the tent. Abu Abdullah says, oh Rabab, your sacrifice has been completed. See your sacrifice, bid farewell to it before you return back to the tent. After this, they say on the day of Ashura, Abu Abdullah carried many marhumin, carried many who were deceased, many shuhada, but he dug only one grave on the day of Ashura. They said that Abu Abdullah went behind the tents and using Dhul Fiqar, dug a grave for Asghar. The poets describe that we imagine Dhul Fiqar wept in this moment. They say there are 2 things that the oppression on them was so difficult we would say that they would weep. One is the earrings of Zahra that were broken when her face was struck. The second is that Dhul Fiqar that was used by Abu Abdullah to dig the grave of Asghar. If that sword could speak, it would say, I was sent from heaven to defend the children of Rasulullah, not to dig their graves. A poet describes, we imagine Abu Abdullah laid this child in the grave and began to fill the grave from the feet. He filled to the legs, filled to the chest, and then he would stop. And he would complain and say, oh Asghar, your skin is so soft, the sand is so hot. How does your father cause the pain of putting hot sand on your soft cheeks? Abu Abdullah, why did you dig the grave of Asghar? So that when the Mal'uneen wanted to collect the heads of Shuhada, that Asghar would not be someone whose head would be collected. But oh Abu Abdullah, the day after Ashura, when they collected the heads, Shimr Mal'un called out, there is one shaheed who is missing. There is one supporter of Hussain who is missing. They said, who is missing? They said the Radi', that infant child who nurses from his mother that was killed by Harmala. They said his grave was dug somewhere behind the tents. Umar Asad gave the command. They took spears to the sand to find the grave of Asghar. Have you seen the size of a spear and the size of a child? When they found the grave, not just the head of Asghar, all of Asghar was reason. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون